Hello and welcome to part 3 of the training. In this part, we will cover the main steps and key points of effective project planning. All types of projects, predictive, adaptive, and hybrid, need to be planned before they are approved for execution and provided with necessary resources. The result of project planning is a project plan. Project plan is a set of documents that describe how project will be executed, controlled, and closed. The project plan contains two main parts. Project baseline. This defines the agreed upon targets for scope, schedule, and cost. They serve as reference points against which project performance will be measured and controlled. And the second part is project ways of working. This describes the specific rules, processes, and procedures that govern project team day-to-day collaboration and decision-making. Project ways of working guidelines are typically adapted from the organization's general project management framework. These ways of working should follow the KISS principle, keep it simple and standard. They must be clearly communicated to all project participants, understood and actively supported by project owner and project manager to ensure smooth execution. How to develop a project plan. Project planning should conclude with the project plan being approved by the project owner and the project manager being authorized to secure the resources planned for the project execution. If the project will be delivered by the project delivery team, it should not be planned by the project manager alone. That's why before real planning starts, the project manager should onboard to the project team members named in the project charter and involve them in project planning. After project planning team is assembled, development of the project plan can start. Development of a project plan can be divided into two parts. Define the project scope and define the project delivery. Where define the project scope part includes four steps. Identify the project opportunity, identify the stakeholder requirements, identify optimal solution that would meet the stakeholder requirements, and define the project scope. Define the project delivery part also include four steps. Develop project work breakdown structure or WBS, develop project schedule, update project right register, and finally develop the project budget. Experienced project managers typically go through all 8 steps. Less experienced project managers often rely on only 4. Can you guess which steps they tend to skip? Correct, they often skip the critical steps needed to properly define the project scope and jump straight into project delivery planning activities. They assume that the information in the project charter is correct, complete, and sufficient for planning. In reality, that's rarely the case. In this training, you will learn how to perform each step, starting with identifying the project opportunity, then identifying the stakeholder requirements, following by identifying optimal solution to be delivered by the project, and so on. And the best way to really learn all these steps is to apply them directly to your own project, if you have one. As the quote attributed to Lao Tzu says, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So don't just listen and watch. Apply each step as you develop your own project plan. And if it feels uncomfortable or difficult the first time, that is actually a good sign. It means that you are truly learning something new, because new is always difficult before it becomes easy. Before we start planning how to execute a project, we need to be confident that we understand what the project is really meant to achieve. That starts with defining the project opportunity. So what is a project opportunity? Simply put, it's the set of issues, needs, or challenges that the client wants the project to address. Project client can be any stakeholder the project is intended to help. If project opportunity is not seen as important, the project may struggle to get resources, management attention, and stakeholder support. So before we move into execution planning, we need to clearly understand the opportunity behind the project, what issues we are addressing, who it matters to, and why it matters now. So, how to identify and define a project opportunity? One source I have found especially helpful is the book Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play. I have taken 3 principles from this book that shape the way I approach conversations with clients when I want to understand and validate a project opportunity. The first one is intent counts more than technique. In other words, the most important thing is not the specific method or framework we use. What matters most is whether we genuinely want to help the client succeed. When clients feel that we are sincerely interested in their success, they are more likely to share their real needs, concerns, and expectations. The second principle is no guessing. In other words, we should not assume that we know what the client needs or wants. We need to ask, listen, and clarify. If something is unclear, incomplete, or confusing, we should ask for clarification. This is particularly important when we suspect that the answer may challenge our assumptions or may not be what we hope or want to hear. Those are often the moments when slowing down and asking to clarify is most valuable. The third principle is structure the conversation. In other words, a good conversation should feel natural, but it should not be random. We need a consistent set of simple, clear questions that would help us to uncover and understand the client's issues, the impact of those issues, as well as what success might look like for the client. Together, these 3 principles help ensure that we do not define the project opportunity based on our guesses. Instead, we define it based on clear understanding of clients' real needs, priorities, and desired outcomes. So, how to structure our project opportunity identification conversation with project clients? I recommend breaking the conversation into 4 parts. Part 1 is to set context and agenda for the conversation. Begin by explaining that the purpose of the conversation is not to talk about project solution, but to understand what issues the project is meant to address. Part 2 is to brainstorm with customer a list of clients' issues. For that purpose, use 3 simple questions. What are all the issues the project should address, where issues are both problems and opportunities the clients see? Then repeatedly ask, and what else, to help client uncover additional issues, and before finalizing the brainstorming session, read the list of issues you have captured and ask, did I get it right? Did I leave anything out? If you ask the last 2 questions, you will be often provided with additional valuable issues to be added to the list. Part 3 is to uncover issues, evidence, and impact. Once you have the list of issues confirmed by the client to be correct and complete, you have to go deeper into each item on the list. Use these 5 questions to uncover each issue significance. First, ask what's letting customer know it's a real issue. Then ask what is the impact of the issue if it is not resolved, as well as what would be the impact of the issue if it is resolved. What will let customer know that the issue was resolved? And finally, who cares most about the issue to be resolved? In other words, who has the highest interest and agency for the issue to be successfully addressed? And finally, explore issues, context, and constraints. Ask a few more questions, such as who or what else is affected by the issue to identify additional stakeholders who would like the issue to be addressed. What has stopped the organization from successfully addressing this issue earlier and what is different now? In other words, what past impediments may still remain and have to be taken into consideration, as well as what, if anything, might prevent the project from successfully addressing the issue. In other words, what risks might affect success of the project. By summarizing what the client says and asking clarifying questions, you will not only understand what the project needs to deliver, but also build customer trust and engagement. When I interview project clients, I use a simple Excel worksheet to capture the information in a structured way. You can see an example of such worksheet on the screen. The idea is to make sure that we collect the same type of information across different interviews so that we can analyze it properly afterwards. Once the interviews are completed and the worksheet has been filled in, the next step is to analyze the data. The analysis should help understand which issues are most important from the client's perspective, how urgent they are, and whether they are realistic for the project to address. This analysis should help the project manager and the project owner have a focused discussion about what the project should address and, as importantly, what it should not address. The matrix shown on this slide is used to map all early identified client issues across two dimensions, value and urgency. The analysis is done in three steps. First, assess the relative value and urgency of each identified issue and position it on the matrix. This helps to distinguish between issues that are highly valuable and urgent and those that may be less critical or less sensitive. Second, mark which issues are feasible for the project to address and which are not. This is important because not every important client issue can or should become part of project scope. Some issues may be outside the project's mandate, beyond available resources, technically unrealistic, or dependent on other initiatives. Third, discuss and agree with the project owner which issues will be included in the project scope and which will be excluded, deferred, or handled elsewhere. The goal is to make sure that the project focuses on the most valuable and urgent opportunities, but only those which it can successfully address. For a project to be considered successful, it must satisfy stakeholders' requirements and, wherever possible, exceed their expectations. Requirements represent stakeholders' needs, expectations, and constraints, and they may be explicitly stated, generally implied, or mandated by regulations, standards, or organizational policies. However, requirements cannot be delivered effectively unless they are first identified, documented, analyzed, prioritized, and formally agreed upon. This makes requirements management one of the project manager's key responsibilities. Working closely with the project team and stakeholders, the project manager must ensure that relevant requirements are collected, understood, and clarified so that the project can achieve its intended goals and objectives. Not all stakeholder requirements are the same. They can be grouped into three distinct levels. The first level is project outcome requirements. These describe the issues the project should address. They explain why the project matters and what value it is expected to create. We covered how to identify these requirements in the previous slides. The second level is project solution requirements. These describe what functional and non-functional requirements the project solution, product, or result must fulfill to be considered by stakeholders as fit for purpose and fit for use. And finally, the third level is project delivery requirements. These define expectations for how the project should be managed, delivered, and closed. So by investigating project requirements across these three levels, a project team can create a clear picture about the project, why the project is needed and how urgent it is, what it must deliver, and how it should be performed. Here's an example of requirements for a simple project aimed to conduct an off-site event. Product requirements of the project describe requirements for the project deliverables, such as venue, food, and entertainment, while delivery requirements define how the event should be planned and managed. The requirements include conformance with company policies, need to secure timely approvals, and capture lessons learned. So, how do we identify stakeholder requirements? There are a few ways to do it, and some are more reliable than others. The first one is guessing. It is fast, and honestly, it happens quite often. We assume we know what stakeholders need based on our own experience interpretation of the situation. But the problem is that such assumptions are often wrong. At best, guessing can give us a hypothesis, but not a validated requirement. The second way is asking stakeholders directly. This is clearly better because we involve the people who actually have the need or expectation. But even this approach has limits. Stakeholders may not always know exactly what they need or want. This is why Steve Jobs' quote is useful to remember. A lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them. The most reliable way of collecting true requirements, observation and demonstration. This means observing what people actually do and how they do it, as well as demonstrating solution or product prototypes and collecting feedback. Of course, this takes more time and effort than a standard interview. However, it often reveals needs, constraints, and expectations that stakeholders may not mention or may not even be aware of during normal conversation. The key message is this: requirements must be discovered and validated, not guessed. We do that by interviewing stakeholders, observing their actual behavior, and using prototypes to gather their feedback and to test our assumptions. Stakeholder requirements have been collected, they need to be evaluated and prioritized. It is necessary because not all requirements are of equal importance. Some are critical for project success, while others may be nice to have. Some create high value, while others may add cost, complexity, or risk without contributing much to the project goal. Prioritization helps us make better decisions about what should be included in the project scope and what should be excluded or deferred. It also helps simplify the project. If we include too many low-value or high-risk requirements, the project becomes too complex, too expensive, and harder to deliver. The team may become overloaded, timelines may increase, and the risk of failure may grow. So by excluding or deferring unnecessary requirements, we can keep the project focused on what matters most. The goal is to maximize project value while at the same time keep project scope realistic and manageable. So how stakeholder requirements should be evaluated and prioritized? The Eisenhower matrix and the Kano model can be used together to evaluate and prioritize stakeholder requirements in a structured way. The Eisenhower matrix helps us to sort requirements into four groups: quick wins, big bets, maybes, and distractions. Quick wins are high-value requirements that are relatively easy to deliver. This should normally be secured first. Big bets are also high-value requirements, but they require more effort, resources, and pose higher risk. These may still be worth including, but only if they are achievable within the project constraints. Maybes and distractions should normally be avoided, deferred, or challenged because they may add complexity without creating enough value. After we have selected the most relevant requirements, we can use a Kanna model to understand how each requirement affects stakeholder satisfaction. Some requirements are mandatory or basic. This must be fulfilled completely because if we do not fulfill them, stakeholders will be dissatisfied. Other requirements are desired and performance related. The better we fulfill them, the more satisfied stakeholders become. And finally, some requirements are optional or delight us. Stakeholders may not expect them, but if we deliver them, they can create a positive surprise or a wow effect. So by using these two tools together, we can make sure the project doesn't simply try to deliver everything. Instead, we focus on the requirements that are valuable, realistic, and have a highest impact on stakeholder satisfaction. The goal is to plan the project so that it delivers the right things with the right level of ambition and avoids unnecessary complexity. To manage stakeholder requirements, I recommend using Requirement Traceability Matrix or RTM. This can be a very simple Excel file like the one shown on the slide. The important thing is not the tool itself, but the discipline of documenting requirements in a structured and traceable way. When we capture requirements, we should make sure they are clear, concise, verifiable, consistent, complete, and traceable. That means each requirement should be easy to understand, specific enough to be tested, free from contradictions, and linked back to the stakeholder or business need it came from. This matters because requirements which are vague or only discussed verbally can easily lead to misunderstandings later in the project. A useful project management rule is what is not on paper was never said. So if requirement is important, it should be written down, reviewed, agreed, and managed. By documenting and proactively managing requirements in requirement traceability matrix, we reduce confusion and avoid unpleasant surprises when implementing the project. Also, if existing requirements need to be changed during project execution, the requirements traceability matrix provides valuable information about which stakeholders should be informed, which project objectives may be affected by the change, and which WBS, so work breakdown structure elements, may need to be modified. After project requirements being defined, evaluated, and prioritized, next step is to identify and evaluate alternative solutions to address project opportunity and select one to be implemented. Even if flawless execution cannot compensate for choosing a wrong or weak solution, that's why this step is of critical importance. Since every project is unique and involves uncertainty, there is no warranted formula for discovering the best solution. However, we can apply proven heuristics to significantly improve our chances of success. The first heuristic is this: don't go with the first idea that comes to your mind. It's rarely the best, it's just the loudest. As highlighted in McKinsey article, teams that consider at least two valid alternatives are up to 6 times likely to identify successful solution. Just as a mountain can be climbed from multiple paths, most problems can be solved in different ways. In other words, the best way to get a good idea is to consider a lot of ideas. The second heuristic is that the quality of your solution depends on the quality of your thinking process. One of the most effective processes I have come across to develop unique solutions is the strategic problems solving method developed by Roger Martin. Strategic problem solving method developed by Roger Martin consists of 8 steps. First step is to define project opportunity. Purpose of this step is to define stakeholder issues and the requirements to be addressed by the project. How to do it was discussed in the earlier part of the presentation. After project opportunity is defined, next step is to identify approaches that can be used to address the project opportunity. For example, buy or build the solution, own the solution or lease it as a service, and so on. After possible alternative approaches have been identified, next step is to brainstorm possible solutions within each of the approach that would allow to address stakeholders' issues and meet their requirements. After brainstorming is done, for each identified possible solution, define what must be true for solution to be sound. These are preconditions that need to hold true for the solution to be valid. After preconditions are identified and agreed, next step is to identify possible barriers, which are those preconditions which seem least likely to hold true. Sixth step is to design validation tests to test if the barriers do exist and cannot be removed. Seventh step is to execute validation tests and analyze results. Testing should start by testing most probable barriers to quickly eliminate invalid solutions. And finally, the last step is to decide on the best solution from among those that passed all validation steps. Application of this approach ensures that decisions are based on logic, evidence, and structured thinking, not just on guesses and hopes. As a result of completing the first 3 steps of project planning stage, we now have a lot of information about project opportunities, stakeholder requirements, as well as possible solutions to address the opportunity and the requirements. As the saying goes, an abundance of information creates a poverty of attention. To ensure that stakeholders and the project team share the same expectations, this information must be summarized into its essence. This is done by creating the project scope statement. The purpose of project scope statement is twofold. First, to set clear expectations with stakeholders about what the project will deliver and what it will not deliver, as well as to create a stable basis for the project delivery team to start planning the project work in detail. So, how to define the project scope statement? Scope statement document template shown on the slide can help to do that. Project scope statement is a crisp summary of project opportunity and stakeholders' requirements in terms of project objectives and key results, product scope, which defines required project outputs or deliverables from customer point of view, project scope, which defines the work required to deliver the product scope, project deliverables and acceptance criteria for them, as well as project constraints and assumptions. In project management, product scope defines what the final deliverables will be, while project scope defines how those deliverables will be created. And do not forget that once you have created the project scope statement, you shall validate it with key stakeholders, or at the very least with the project owner, to ensure shared understanding and agreement. Also remember that this document becomes part of the formal project plan, and once approved, it becomes the project plan scope baseline. After being approved by the project owner, project scope baseline can only be changed through the formal project change management process. You may be familiar with the old African proverb, the best way to eat an elephant is to cut it into small pieces. That proverb captures the essence of how we should approach complicated endeavors such like projects. Every project involves many activities and deliverables. To successfully manage this complexity, we need to break the work down into manageable and assignable parts. That's exactly what the project work breakdown structure helps us to do. A project work breakdown structure is a deliverable-oriented hierarchical decomposition of the total project scope into smaller components. These components are organized into deliverables and work packages that can be then clearly assigned, estimated, planned, executed, and monitored. The depth of decomposition depends on the level of control required to manage the project effectively. Key elements or components of WBS hierarchy are deliverables and work packages. Deliverables are verifiable work breakdown structure elements such as products, services, events, or results to be produced by a project in order to achieve the project objectives. Deliverables represent what the project must achieve or provide, and each deliverable is further broken down into one or more work packages. Work packages are the lowest level WBS elements. Work packages define how the deliverables will be produced. Each work package consists of scheduled activities or tasks required to complete the work package. Work packages are planned and controlled by the project manager, while ownership of the work packages for estimation and execution is assigned to work package owners, who might be individual project participants or teams. Some might claim that agile projects, especially those using Scrum, don't need WBS, and I respectfully disagree. In Scrum, backlog items such as epics and features can be seen as deliverables of a different hierarchical level, and user stories can be seen as work packages. User stories, same as work packages, are assigned to agile teams for planning and delivery. So yes, agile product owners can also benefit from creating WBS to organize their product backlogs. So, how do we document the project WBS work breakdown structure? Usually, WBS documentation has two parts. The first part is the WBS diagram. This is the visual breakdown of the project scope. It shows how the total scope is divided into deliverables and then further broken down into smaller work packages. The second part of WBS is a dictionary, WBS dictionary. This is where we add the detail behind the diagram. For each WBS element, the dictionary explains what is included, what is excluded, what quality requirements or constraints apply, who is accountable, and how the deliverable will be verified before being accepted. This is important because WBS diagram alone may not provide enough detail. Two people may look at the same WBS item in the diagram and understand it differently. The dictionary helps to avoid that problem by making the meaning of each WBS element explicit and clear. So together, the WBS diagram and WBS dictionary give us a complete picture of the project scope, what will be delivered, how the work is structured, who owns each part, and how completion will be confirmed. Work breakdown structure is one of the most useful project management documents. It shows all the work that needs to be done in order to deliver the project, and because of that, many other planning documents are built from it, such as a resource plan, schedule, and budget. The importance of WBS is so significant that Project Management Institute has even published a separate practice standard dedicated specifically to WBS development and use. This is because WBS has proven to be a critical tool for successfully defining, planning, communicating, and controlling scope of any project. Here is an example of the work breakdown structure template I normally use. There are a few things to keep in mind when building your WBS. First, the WBS should focus on what needs to be delivered, not how the work will be done or when it will happen. A timing, sequence, and dependencies will be defined later when we develop the project schedule. Second, the WBS doesn't show the order of work or dependencies between activities. For that, we use tools such as network diagrams and Gantt charts. And finally, do not forget to include into your WBS project management and other project support deliverables and work packages. Here is a WBS example from one of my real projects. I want to show this because WBS can sometimes feel quite abstract until you see how it looks in practice. And yes, the first time you create a WBS, it may feel a bit difficult, awkward, but that's normal. Creating a WBS is a skill, like riding a bicycle. It may feel awkward at the beginning, but once you try it a few times, it becomes much easier and even pleasant. If you want to create a high-quality WBS, here are some simple rules about web breakdown structure, format, content, and information integrity. When it comes to WBS format, it shall be deliverable-oriented, not activity-oriented. It shall employ a coding scheme for each element that clearly identifies its hierarchical location, and it shall have a clear and logically organized structure. When it comes to WBS content, it shall contain 100% of the work defined in the project scope. Each level of decomposition must be messy or mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. It shall capture all internal, external, and interim deliverables, including management deliverables and transition deliverables. It shall also show clear accountability for each deliverable and enable effective control by the project manager. When it comes to WBS information sourcing and maintenance, it shall be created by people who will be performing the work because they know the best. It shall be developed with input from technical experts and key stakeholders, and shall be maintained under change control once the project scope is baselined. To create a useful project schedule, we need to answer two key questions. First, why do we need a project schedule? And next, how do we develop one? The answer to the first question is straightforward. A project schedule is needed to enable effective and efficient project execution and control. The second question is how we develop a project schedule. For this, the Project Management Institute, or PMI, has published a dedicated resource called the Practice Standard for Scheduling. This standard provides detailed guidance on scheduling principles and practices and can be applied across different types of projects, from predictive or waterfall to adaptive or agile. As shown on the slide, the project schedule is developed through 5 steps. First is to define activities and milestones which have to be performed and controlled. Second step is to sequence project activities. Third step is to estimate activity resources. Fourth step is to estimate activity durations. And the fifth step is to develop the project schedule. Each of these 5 steps builds on the previous one. Let's examine now how to perform each of these steps. The purpose of this step is to identify all activities required to complete the work packages defined in the work breakdown structure. This is done by decomposing each work package into individual schedule activities. A schedule activity is a distinct and assignable portion of work that must be performed in order to deliver a work package. At the same time, we also need to identify key milestone events that will be used to monitor, control, and report project progress. Milestones are significant events or points in the project timeline. They usually mark the completion of a major deliverable, important decision, phase gate, approval, or other key control point. Milestones are important because they help the project manager and stakeholders track progress at a higher level without need to go into every activity. In other words, work breakdown structure tells us what needs to be delivered, while activity list helps us understand what work must be done to deliver it. The key message is that before we can build a realistic project schedule, we first need to clearly identify the work activities and milestones that the schedule will be based on. Where activities and milestones should be documented. Activities and milestones should be documented in a separate activity list. Example of a simple activity list template is shown on the screen. The template is not set in stone, so feel free to adapt it as needed to suit the specific needs of your project. After all relevant activities and milestones have been identified and documented in activity list, the next step is to identify the predecessor-successor relationships between them. In other words, we need to understand which activities must happen before other activities can start or finish. One of the most commonly used tools for identifying and visualizing these dependencies is the activity on node diagram shown on the screen. A practical and effective way to create such a diagram is to do it together with your project team. You can start by bringing the team together in front of a whiteboard or a large wall. Write each activity on a separate sticky note, one activity per note. Then place the sticky notes on the wall in a way that shows the logical sequence of work and the relationships between activities. And once the team is satisfied with the general flow, draw arrows between the activities to show the dependencies. This approach has two benefits. First, it helps you create the network diagram in a simple and visual way. Second, it helps the project team develop a shared understanding of how the work is connected. After the activity on network diagram has been created and validated, the activity list should be updated with dependency information. For each activity and milestone, you should document its predecessors and, where relevant, any lead and lag time. It is also important to remember that dependencies can be of different types. Some dependencies are mandatory. These are required by the nature of the work, technical constraints, contractual obligations, or regulations. They are sometimes called hard logic. Other dependencies are discretionary. These are based on preferred ways of working, best practices, resource considerations, or team judgment. They are sometimes called soft logic. Mandatory dependencies are especially important because ignoring them can make the schedule unrealistic or impossible to execute. So, when developing the project schedule, make sure that all mandatory dependencies are clearly identified, validated, and documented in the activity list. The goal is to create a realistic view of how project work is connected before we start estimating durations, assigning resources, and building the final schedule. There are four types of dependencies between schedule activities, namely finish to start to finish, start to start, and start to finish. The most common dependency type is finish to start, where one activity must finish before the next can start. As mentioned earlier, the chronological relationship between a predecessor and a successor activities is described not only by the dependency type, but also by the associated lead and lag time. Lead time and lag time are scheduling adjustments used to fine-tune dependencies between activities. Lead time allows a successor activity to start earlier before the predecessor activity is fully completed. Lag time introduces a required waiting period between the predecessor and successor activities. For example, after concrete foundations are poured, the concrete needs several days to gain enough strength before wall construction can start. In this case, the required waiting period between completing the foundation and starting wall construction is specified as a lag time. After the project activities have been identified and sequenced, the next step is to estimate resources required to perform the work. To do this, we need to answer two key questions. First, what resources and in what quantity are required to perform each activity? And second, who will provide those resources? This step is important because a schedule is only realistic if it is based on the actual resources needed and on availability of those resources. There are several tools or techniques that can be used for resource estimation. The most common technique is expert judgment. In practice, this usually means asking the owner of the relevant web package or other subject matter expert to estimate what resources are needed to complete the activity. These experts are often best placed to understand the nature of the work, the skills required, the level of effort involved, and any constraints that may affect availability of needed resources. Where available, published reference data, historical project information, benchmarks, or organizational standards can also be used to support or validate the estimates. The key point is that resource estimates should not be guessed. They should be based on informed input from people who understand the work and supported by relevant data whenever possible. After the required resources have been identified, this information can be used to estimate the likely duration of each activity. To estimate activity duration, we need to answer one key question. How much time will it take to complete the work with the planned resources? There are several tools and techniques that can be used to support duration estimation. And as with resource estimation, the most common approach is expert judgment. However, we need to remember that all people, including experts, are influenced by cognitive biases. One common example of such bias is planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate and sometimes overestimate the time and resources required to complete a task. For example, individuals often overestimate their own capabilities, which can result in over-optimistic estimates. Conversely, risk aversion can lead to over-pessimistic estimates. That's why it's important not to ask for just a single number estimate for activity duration. Instead, we have to ask for a range of possible durations, from optimistic to pessimistic. As was mentioned earlier, there are two most common errors when doing estimations. First, we expect to find out a single number for activity duration. Second, we do not account for cognitive biases, which we all have. When someone provides us with a single number estimation, we usually do not know if it is optimistic, pessimistic, or most likely. And even if we were explicitly said, for example, that this is a most likely estimation, a single number would not say anything about the estimation uncertainty, and we will not know what contingency time should be added. The way to get a better understanding about both expected activity duration as well as the level of uncertainty is to consider not one but three possible durations: optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely. This is known as PERT, or Program Evaluation Review technique. Using these three estimations, we can calculate the expected activity duration as a sum of optimistic plus pessimistic plus 4 times most likely divided by 6. And when in a project we have a sequence of activities, then expected duration of the sequence is calculated as a sum of expected durations of all the activities in the sequence. After completing the previous steps, all project activities should now be identified, sequenced, and estimated. This information can be used to develop the project schedule. The project schedule shows the project milestones and activities, their planned dates, durations, dependencies, and assigned resources. However, for a schedule to be useful, it must also be easy to read, understand, and maintain. If the schedule is too complex or unclear, it will not be used effectively by the project team or stakeholders. The most common way to present a project schedule is by using a Gantt chart, also known as a detailed schedule. A Gantt chart is a bar chart that illustrates project activities and milestones over time. It shows activities, planned durations, start and finish dates, dependencies, and assigned resources. There are two commonly used methods for creating and managing project schedules: the critical path method, or CPM, and critical chain project management method, or CCPM. The critical path method is the most widely used scheduling method. It focuses on identifying the long sequence of interdependent activities that determines the minimum project duration. However, while use of CPM is most common, it is not the most effective approach for planning and controlling project execution. A more effective approach in many situations is critical chain project management. Critical chain project management is a contemporary scheduling and control method based on theory of constraints. The key idea is that instead of trying to control every single task deadline in isolation, critical chain project management protects waste-free execution of activities which belong to the critical chain of the project and helps management attention to be focused on resource constraints, estimations uncertainty, and human behavior. If you're interested to learn about critical chain project management method, I would like to recommend checking short videos using URLs shown on the screen. What is a write register and why to update it now? As you already know, a write register is a tool used throughout the project lifecycle to track and manage project risk, assumptions, issues, dependencies, and decisions that might impact project objectives. At this stage of planning process, we have already defined what the project will deliver and how it will be delivered. As a result, we should now understand the key assumptions underlying the selected solution and delivery plan, the issues that already exist and must be addressed, as well as external project to the project delivery team dependencies and decisions that need to be secured to enable successful delivery. These items must be documented now so that they can be actively managed rather than overlooked until they become major problems. In addition to known assumptions, issues, dependencies, and decisions, there are other uncertain events or conditions that could impact project success. These are recorded as risks in the write register. All projects are planned for success, yet many fail because risks are not identified and managed early enough. Managing risks proactively is typically easier, cheaper, and safer than dealing with their consequences later. That's why risk management starts during the planning phase and continues throughout execution. The write register is our primary tool to document, assess, assign, treat, monitor, and report on project risks, as well as track the effectiveness of risk responses and learn over time. In short, fortune favors the prepared. In other words, if we want to be lucky, we have to know and manage our project risks. Okay, so how should we manage project risks? Project Management Institute has published a separate standard, the Standard for Risk Management, which can help. At the core of the standard is the risk management life cycle, a logical sequence of 6 interrelated processes, such as plan risk management, identify risks, perform risk analysis, plan risk responses, implement risk responses, and monitor risks. Two most important processes are highlighted. They are risk identification and risk responses implementation processes. On the following slides, I will describe each of the processes in more detail. Before we proceed with risk management in the project, the first thing to do is to agree how we will do risk management, what needs to be done, who has to do what, and so on. This is achieved with the help of the first risk management process, plan risk management. The purpose of plan risk management process is to describe how risks to be managed in the project. There should be no guessing within project team about who shall do what, when, why, and how. The outcome of the process should be agreed by the project team and validated by the project owner. The easiest way to create such a guideline is to use the guideline shown on the screen and adapt it to the needs of your project. In addition to the guideline, project risk appetite, risk scales, and risk limits have to be agreed with the project owner. All projects are different, so the project risk appetite, risk scale, and risk limits have to be validated by the project owner before they can be used to analyze identified risks and plan adequate risk responses. In the right register template, there is a separate worksheet where the project risk appetite, risk scales, and risk limits shall be documented. The second risk management process is to identify risks. The purpose of the identify risks process is to identify project risks early and define them clearly in the right register so that they can be properly assessed and treated. The base technique to identify project downside risk during project planning stage is to conduct project pre-mortem by putting everything is known about the project on the table and asking project team to imagine that the project have failed and then to brainstorm backwards the most probable causes of the project failure. It is advisable also to run two separate risk identification workshops, one for downside risks that could threaten project success and another one for upside risks, opportunities that could improve project outcomes. After risks are identified, they have to be analyzed. The purpose of risk analysis is to assess probability and impact of each risk on project objectives in order to categorize and prioritize individual risks for future treatment. There are many methods for risk analysis. There is even an international standard dedicated to risk assessment techniques. Among other methods, expert judgment together with probability impact scale and probability impact matrix are the easiest and most commonly used methods to do risk analysis. Risk assessment doesn't need to be perfectly precise. It needs to be accurate enough to support good risk prioritization and the selection of appropriate response actions. Once risks have been identified and analyzed, the next step is to develop appropriate risk treatment measures that will modify each risk value and to acceptable level. The purpose of risk response planning process is to select the most suitable risk treatment approach for each risk based on the risk level. Risk treatment approaches for downside risks are avoidance, transfer, reduction, or acceptance. After risk treatment approach is selected, relevant SMART risk mitigation actions have to be decided, where SMART stands for specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-bound. To ensure effective risk management, each identified risk must be assigned to a risk owner. A risk owner will be accountable for effective treatment and monitoring of assigned risks. Where appropriate, risk owners may also appoint risk mitigation action owners, and the risk mitigation action owners are responsible for implementing specific risk mitigation actions and monitoring their effectiveness. Risk treatment is the most critical part of risk management process because without effective risk treatment, risk management is basically a waste of time and effort. So how to implement risk treatment measures? Risk treatment is an iterative process. Add risk treatment responses into project plan, then implement the risk responses. After that, assess effectiveness of implemented risk responses and decide whether the residual and secondary risk level is acceptable. And if this level is not acceptable, then repeat the cycle. What is important to remember is that all time and effort spent to identify risks, analyze them, as well as to plan treatment actions will be wasted if treatment actions are not implemented. So if risk treatment actions are worth doing, implement them and adjust if needed. Do not let risk grow and turn into issues. Risk management is not one-time activity. It must continue throughout the full project lifecycle. At the planning stage, we identify risks, assess their probability and impact, and define response actions. But during execution, the project environment changes, new risks appear, likelihood and potential impact of early identified and managed risks change. Some risks disappear and some risks turn into issues. That is why risks must be monitored regularly. The purpose of risk monitoring is to ensure that key risks remain visible. Risk owners take agreed actions, mitigation plans are working, new risks are identified early, and escalations happens before risks become major issues. Monitor risk activities include controlling implementation of risk response plans, tracking identified risks, monitoring residual and secondary risks, identifying emergent risks, and evaluating overall effectiveness of risk management throughout the project. When it comes to execution of the process, risks should be monitored throughout regular RIDE register reviews and discussed in governance, management, and delivery team meetings. When it comes to learning about risk management, I would like to recommend three sources. Two risk management standards, one from Project Management Institute and the other one from International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and the book written by David Hilson and Peter Simon on practical project management. David Hilson also has recorded 100 short YouTube videos on risk management, which I highly recommend. To watch all 100 videos can take more than 8 hours, but you can start with just 6 listed on the screen. For easy access, all URLs can be found below in the description part of this video. Creating a project budget is the final step in project planning. But before developing a project budget, it's essential to answer a key question: who needs the project budget and for what purpose? Typically, the project owner and project manager are the main users of a project budget, and they rely on it to align stakeholders' expectations regarding the total cost, expected cost of the project, to secure adequate and timely project funding, and to monitor and control the project delivery efficiency and speed. How do we determine the project budget? Project activities and resources required to perform them are identified during project schedule development step. To develop the project budget, we must first estimate the direct and indirect cost of all scheduled project activities, including the cost of handling planned risk response actions. Next, we have to aggregate the estimated activity costs to create the project cost estimate, sometimes referred to as base estimate. Next, we have to determine the contingency reserve, which is needed to be allocated to address known risks that have been identified and accepted, as well as uncertainty in cost estimates. Then by adding the contingency reserve and the project cost estimate, we can establish the project cost baseline. After that, we have to determine the management reserve, which might be needed for the project, and add it to the project cost baseline to establish the overall project budget. The management reserve is an amount allocated outside of cost baseline to cover unforeseen work and unidentified or unknown risks. Important note is that the management reserve is not included in the project cost baseline, but it is included in the overall project budget and funding requirement. The size of the management reserve is typically determined according to organizational policies and guidelines. In many organizations, it is commonly set between 3 and 10% of the cost baseline, approximately 3% for small and short duration, relatively predictable projects, and up to 10% for large, complex, or long-term projects with high uncertainty. If a situation arises that justifies the use of management reserve funds, the project change control process must be followed to obtain project owner approval to transfer the required amount from management reserve into the project cost baseline. How to know when project planning is done well and you can proceed with the project execution? First, your project plan has to be checked and approved by the project owner. And second, resources required to start execution of the project have to be provided. When it comes to the quality check of your project plan, there are 4 common errors made by unexperienced project managers. First, scope statement and work breakdown structure are usually missing in the project plan. Second, the project plan is too detailed compared to what project manager will be actually able to control or pay attention to. Third, risk management is not represented in work breakdown structure and in the plan, and as a result will be seen as an extra work. And finally, schedule is based on critical path method and unnecessarily wasteful. In high-quality project plans, scope statement and work breakdown structure are mandatory. Project plan is clear, resilient, and adaptive. Risk management is an integral part of work breakdown structure and the plan, and schedule is developed using critical chain project management method. Let's recap what you have just learned in this long session. First, objectives of a project plan stage are two: to develop and approve smart project plan and to authorize project manager to employ resources to execute the approved project plan. To verify successful completion of plan stage, you can use standard checklist similar to one used to check completion of initiate stage. As you can see from the checklist, project manager is accountable for most of deliverables of the plan stage, while project owner is accountable just for 3 last deliverables, 8, 9, and 10. When it comes to development of a project plan, 8 steps have to be performed in the following sequence: identify project opportunity, identify stakeholder requirements, identify optimal solution which will fulfill agreed project requirements, then define project scope. After that, develop project work breakdown structure. Based on project work breakdown structure, we have to develop project schedule. After the schedule is ready, we can update right register and if needed, add additional activities and schedule them to mitigate identified project risks. And finally, we can develop a project budget. Thank you for attention. I hope that by now you have a clear understanding why a project plan is needed, what it should include, and how to develop it effectively. This has been a long session, but before we conclude, I'd like to invite you to pause for a moment and reflect what you have just learned. So please pause the presentation and consider the following 2 questions. First, which ideas would you like to remember and apply in your projects, as well as when and where you will try them? And remember, the value of this presentation will ultimately be determined not by what you have seen or heard today, but by what you will do differently tomorrow. So take a minute. That's it what I wanted to share with you about project planning. This was a long video, so thank you for your attention. In the next part, in part 4, we will cover what needs to be done to make project execution stage a success. We'll talk about most common impediments to effective and efficient execution, as well as how to deal with them. So if you're interested, see you there. Bye.